Tim Hudak calls them bold ideas to get Ontario working again. The Ontario Progressive Conservatives discussion paper on what it calls flexible labour markets would dramatically shake things up and change some labour practices that have been around for more than half a century. Joining us now to discuss, Charlotte Yates. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at McMaster University in Hamilton. Anil Verma, Professor of Human Resource Management and Industrial Relations at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. Gregory Thomas, Federal Ontario Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You always have to look up at the camera when I introduce you, not make notes. Well done, Gregory. Okay. And we welcome back Tim Hudak, who's the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. Good to have everybody here. Thanks for making the drive in from Hamilton tonight, Charlotte. I want to, just on the chance that some of our viewers don't know that much about this, go through just a bit of a highlight pack here of what's in the so-called flexible labour markets package that the Conservatives have unveiled, and we'll go from there. Here we go. If you would bring this up, please. No worker should be required, the package says, to become a member of a union or pay union dues as a condition of employment. Union leaders, not employers, should collect dues from the workers they represent. Amend legislation so that unions must provide full and transparent disclosure of their revenues and how they spend funds. Mandate the secret ballot in all certification votes in Ontario. Abolish the practice of closed tendering across Ontario's public sectors. More clearly define the mandate of the Ontario Labour Relations Board, and allow private companies to compete with the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board for the provision of workplace insurance. Wonder what Liz Whitmer would think of that. We'll get to that another time.
Hopefully we'll see.
We will. We're going to focus mostly, again, we don't cover the waterfront here. We're going to focus on two of these recommendations tonight, whether employees should have to pay union dues and the abolition of closed tendering. We should let you know that Daniel Kitts, who produced the program tonight, has written a blog post on some of these other things. So if you want to read more about all of the different parts of this conservative package, theagenda.tvo.org is where you'll find Daniel's blog post. Okay, where are we here? One more thing, just before we get Tim Hudak to outline what this is all about. Here is from your discussion paper, Tim. Unions must adapt to the changing economy. They are important players in our economic future. Unfortunately, some have so lost focus that they're now doing things like contributing union dues to the student protesters in Quebec. This kind of behavior is enabled by the extraordinary powers granted to union leaders by government. Because all unionized employees must pay dues or be fired, the union doesn't have to respond to their wishes or needs. We think that should change. Okay. That's the background. What do you want to do about
it? Well, here's the big issue. I mean, this is about jobs. And the challenge Ontario faces in 2012 is that this mighty engine of job creation that we've always believed Ontario to be has sputtered to a halt. We're in a different world in 2012 than in the 1940s when many of these labor laws were brought in. And no business today would be caught using a typewriter or pneumatic tubes. They wouldn't be caught using rotary telephones. So why are we using outdated labor laws in the 1940s? Our plan's comprehensive. You mentioned earlier a new plan for energy. We'll have more on jobs in the economy, including tax and regulatory reform. But a big part of it, Steve, if we want to compete in an increasingly competitive world in 2012, we have to modernize our labor laws, more labor flexibility to create more jobs and build our middle class.
So if a union represents workers at an existing workplace and the company wants to hire more people, you say they should be allowed to without those workers joining a union. Have I got that right?
Yeah, paper says give people a choice. I mean, when you look around, I know that we've had the Rand formula since, 1946,
Better
I think.
Explain what that means, the Rand
formula. The
formula.
Rand formula was a decision, I think, to do as a Chrysler strike in Windsor in 1946. It basically mandated everybody in a workplace under collective agreement would have to be part of the union. Now, that was 1946.
And not even Mike Harris touched the Rand formula.
Although, the Common Sense Revolution was 1994. We did make some big labor changes. I think it's time for the next round because the world is different even in 2012 than 94. But back to my point with respect to what this all means. When you look around the world, United States, United Kingdom, most of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, workers can actually opt out of a union. I actually think it is un-Canadian to say to somebody in a workplace, if you don't join the union, you're fired. How is that possible? How does that represent Canadian values in 2012? Give them a choice, and you know what? That will also make the unions more accountable to the workers they serve.
Charlotte Yates, it's all about choice. What do you say?
Well, first of all, I think you're mistaken. It's not actually true that when you have the RAND formula, you have to join a union. What you have to do is pay union dues. So in that sense, that's quite a big difference, because if you have to join a union, it's a closed shop. If it's RAND formula, you have to pay the dues. Why do they have that? It's because by law, unions have to bargain for all the members of a bargaining unit. So as a result, they absorb the costs of bargaining, grievance, representing those workers.
But he'd let them
And
opt
as
out.
a result, well, exactly. And so you'd have a free rider problem, which is one of the reasons why the RAND formula was ordered in 1946. But there's a bigger set of issues at play here, because the connection between job creation and eliminating the RAND formula is just not a tenable one. Nor is it tenable to say that you will build a middle class as a result of the right to work kind of policies that are being proposed by the progressive conservatives. And in fact, we have enough experience in the United States to say that 11 out of the 15 states that have right to work laws like being proposed have the highest poverty rates in the United States.
A bunch of things we got to unpack there, but let's start with this. What's wrong with a situation where if somebody's hired in a place that's already unionized and they don't want to be in the union,
They don't have to be in the union.
and they don't want to pay the union dues, what's wrong with saying, okay, next time there's a collective agreement, all the people who are in the union get all the new benefits that have been negotiated, and you didn't want to be in the union, you don't get the benefits. What's wrong with that?
Theoretically, that's a possibility. It becomes a very chaotic system. It makes for internal tensions. It makes for competition within the workplace, which actually means, in effect, you're banning unions from that workplace. Because, in effect, what you're saying is that the workers who have voted or, in fact, chosen through a democratic process, because we've got to remember that unions don't just walk into a workplace and announce, we're unionizing. In fact, they have to go through a period of either voting, in a high proportion of the number of workplaces they have to vote for a union, or where there is already a union, it was in some form democratically made part of that. So in that sense, what you're saying is, notwithstanding the fact that the majority of workers chose that union, they in fact don't have the right to bargain effectively, because you're going to let people be either free riders, or you're going to let them on a day-to-day basis decide that unions should represent them. It's too chaotic. It's destabilizing for the workplace.
Gregory Thomas, destabilizing for the workplace. Is it?
No, I think experience shows in other economies in Europe as well as the United States that companies, operations operate with unions and with members and with employees who aren't members of the union and don't pay the dues. It's a challenge, but the workers and their employers make it work, both in the public and in the non-public sector.
Charlotte also says that there's no connection between having a more flexible workplace and having lower unemployment numbers. She says it's actually worse. What do you know on this?
Well, I think the data are all over the map, but what we know from reading the newspapers in Ontario is that employers as varied as Volvo and Daimler and Caterpillar and Xstrata are shuttering operations in Ontario and moving them to other jurisdictions, whether it's Mexico or the Midwestern United States or Quebec or Western Canada.
And what percentage of an inflexible labor market would be accounting for in those decisions?
Who knows?
Who knows? Anna, where were you coming from on this?
Well, you know, any attempt to bring reform to labor is welcome. We always look to our leaders for new ideas. I have reservations about the paths, the 7 paths here at 2 levels. One is that, you know, this relationship between moving union dues and economic growth is kind of simplistic. Employers come to Ontario for all kinds of reasons. Natural resources, proximity to markets, consumer demand, Canadian dollar, the value of the Canadian dollar, and so forth. Labor flexibility or inflexibility is there in the top 10, but it's way down the list. So I think that the claim that if we change the RAND formula in Ontario, why we would be flooded with manufacturing jobs, I think is a bit of a stretch. And if there are any studies, I'd like to see them. I personally think that There's selective, people look at selective evidence so they can find that.
Just hold that thought there, because I want Tim to have a chance to come back at that.
You bet.
Should we put these up now? Okay, Daniel, good idea, actually, because we've been talking about it, so why not? Here's the average yearly economic growth. We've got this bar graph here, which shows in the United States, in those U.S. states with voluntary unionism, there's your average GDP growth, and then in the states with mandatory unionism, it's smaller. Now, can you draw a straight line between those two things? You know, a more flexible labor market equals higher growth rates? You sure you can do that?
Yeah, you can. I mean, it's part of a comprehensive plan, and I appreciate Dr. Verma's point. That's why we also have energy reform, we have tax reform, we have a deregulatory approach. We're going to be pro-trade from Ontario's point of view. But is this an important element? Absolutely. And in fact, you know, some studies have recently shown as well over the last 10 years when you compare optional unionism versus mandatory unionism in the states that had the option had 11% employment growth rate, 11% income growth rate higher than the mandatory union states, and a 3% greater growth rate across the board.
But you're sure that's the reason why?
It's one of the elements, absolutely, it's one of the elements why, and I think, you know, as the economists look at this, they will they'll do the regression models to pick out the variables. So I am confident that this is an important part of moving forward. And listen, we got to do something as well, right? I mean, Ontario is in decline. The manufacturing sector particularly has shed 300,000 jobs. A lot of those jobs have been on the union side. Now, I will say that the private sector unions have been a bit more disciplined in facing these things. They've made some concessions because they're competitive forces. We have a bigger issue with public sector unions that don't face that discipline and have had wage and benefit agreements that are way out of line with what's happening in the private sector. Is a bigger issue there. But I do believe that having a more flexible approach on labor, modernizing our labor laws will be a key element to bringing jobs back to our province. I also think there's some justice issues here too, like union members should be able to say, I don't want my union dues going to Quebec students who are using violent protesting methods for tuition lower than my own sons and daughters are paying here in Ontario.
Okay, you wanted to make a second point.
Yeah, you know, my second point is that if you look at some other evidence, for example, right now, one of the best performing economies is Germany. And Germany has a strong union movement. They sometimes go on strikes, but they're also very productive. And I think that the key to Ontario creating more jobs is to invest in skills of our people, to invest in technology and R&D. And those ideas are going to have a much bigger impact on job creation.
Is the German example really a good one? I mean, Germany's also got a permanent underclass of guest workers who, you know, don't make this comparison completely perfect, if you ask my opinion, and you didn't.
But Germany has definitely, even under the weight of high wages and unionization, they have proved that innovation and creativity and skills can create jobs. Look at Singapore, you know, year after year they have increased wages and they have a fairly strong labor movement, but they're very competitive. They're number 1 or number 2 in the competitiveness index. So my point is that, okay, we can talk about the rights and principles, but if job creation is the focus, then we are looking at in the wrong place to tweak something here. The second point is that
I thought there was a second point.
No, the related point is that when I looked through this, my suspicion is that this document is going to prove to be hugely divisive and polarizing.
Well, let's hold off on that.
Ontarians.
That's the politics of it. Let's just talk about the substance of it first. Yeah. He just made an argument, Tim Hudak did, Charlotte, where he said, you know, if you don't like where your union dues are going right now, there's really nothing you can do about it. And the notion of, you know, Ontario dues-paying members supporting students in Quebec so they can have cheaper tuition than our kids here, you know, that's got to be an issue for a bunch of people, wouldn't you think?
I think it probably is, and that's why there's debates within unions, just as there is within political parties, about how best to prioritize your investments. And so I guess the first principle is that unions are in fact required to have a democratic structure. Their constitutions are reviewed by the labor board. So there are a series of both legislative as well as constitutional means by which unions are required in fact to be internally democratic. So in that sense, if you are a member of a union, you have the right as a member of that union to in fact participate in that union, to be part of the debates, to in fact run for leadership, to run for membership, to So that is the process, just as it is within the Canadian political system, that in fact you can become active and therefore have your voice and therefore change the views of other members and therefore influence the way in which your resources are and your dues are spent. The second part of that is it actually is that any member can in fact review the finances of their union. Again, that is required by law. So it's not as though this is a secret. That's in fact required.
Lots
Now,
of checks and balances in here?
No, well, I mean, the argument, appreciate Professor Yates's arguments, and Sid Ryan will make a similar point, but we're getting a lot of positive responses to individual union members that say, you're darn right. I should be able to say my union dues can go to workplace health and safety, collective bargaining, but I don't want it to go to anti-Israel campaigns. I don't want it to go to campaigns against bottled water. What the heck does that have to do with, where I'm working? Let me make this point too. All we're saying in our paper, flexible labor markets, is let's put the same sort of requirements on the unions and how they spend money that you put on charities, you put on not-for-profits, you put on government, you put on businesses. What's wrong with that transparency? They're trying to do that at the federal level too. Pierre Poilievre, to his credit, the member for Ottawa area, when he saw that the federal civil service union, PSAC I think it was supporting the Separatist Party in the recent Quebec elections.
They did endorse them, didn't they?
Yeah. Come on. So give union members, even if you don't agree with opting out of a union, I think obviously we wouldn't put it forward if we didn't think that was the right way to go. Give union members the right to say, no, my dues should not go to political causes I don't support.
Gregory, what's the taxpayers' interest in this? I understand this is a proposal that Tim Hudak's party is bringing forward in the hopes that employers with a more flexible, in inverted commas, marketplace will create more jobs. What's the taxpayers' angle in this?
Taxpayers don't like to pay 40% more for labor than they could if they contracted themselves. And we've had this horror story with the Toronto Maintenance and Construction Skilled Trades
I was wondering when
Council.
someone was going to bring that up tonight, okay?
And when you talk about a democratic union where people can express themselves, what you see in so many unions across the province is the same leadership that's entrenched in there, and you see nepotism, you see corruption on a grand scale, and you see the labor-dominated elected boards sitting back because they're complicit in it, because they bleed the taxpayer like a milk cow.
You are kind of spitting out the word labor as if it's a swear word. Do you not think that labor has a kind of an honorable role to play in the daily life of this province?
Absolutely. I absolutely do, and we absolutely support the right of Canadians and Ontarians to join unions and to go on strike to protect their economic interests. And conversely, we absolutely support the right of Ontarians and Canadians not to join unions and to go to work even if they're being threatened and intimidated by the likes of the Maintenance Council at the Toronto School Board. I mean, this is corruption.
I'm going to get to that in a second.
There was rudeness. Like these are Toronto Star reporters who are being, cursed with profanity and treated like this guy is some kind of third world despot, and there isn't a single person in Toronto who's standing up to him. Where is the leadership in Toronto?
He just poked you. He says yes. Okay, we're going to get to that in a second, but I want to do one more question on this, because that is a big story, and we do want to get to that. The one thing, though, as we just close this loop that I want to get to is this, Tim.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Should we go on to it? I think I see 20 minutes to go here. Let's forget it. Let's go right on. Can we bring this up here? Because I don't want to lose track of time here, and I want to get to this.
You bet.
Here we go. Top of the next page. Opening up the bidding process, because this is what Gregory's talking about. Restrictive contracting and subcontracting clauses in union collective agreements with public institutions and municipalities have created monopolistic bidding conditions that inflate costs and stifle job creation. More expensive infrastructure means less of it gets built. This means fewer hospitals, fewer roads, and ultimately fewer jobs. Okay, just talk for a second, if you would, Tim, about open tendering, how it would change the way the government does business today.
You bet. Well, as Gregory was just saying, the high visibility issue came to the fore the other day, where we saw that there's a $143 pencil sharpener to install a pencil sharpener in a single classroom in Toronto. There was, I think, 76 hours billed to change an electric socket that should have taken 3 or 4. So this outraged taxpayers, justifiably. We have kids with special needs waiting too long for care. So why does this happen? The Toronto School Board is bound to negotiate with one particular union. And if you're going out to buy a new piece of furniture, a new TV, you shop around, you don't take the first deal, the school board does not do that. Same thing in Hamilton. They're rebuilding Ivor Stadium. You're a big Ticats fan. My team as well. New stadium's coming, but Hamilton, by these outdated labor laws, is restricted to using one particular set of union. That means other companies that may have less politically favored unions or non-union cannot bid on these contracts. The city of Hamilton itself says costs could be up to 40% higher as a result. We want to fix that.
Charlotte, what's the argument for keeping it the way it is?
I happen to agree that there is a need, and I think we all want accountability. We want prudent use of taxpayers' money. The question is, how do we achieve that? And I think the goal of the current system is to, in fact, balance that out with another goal that we have. And this is one which I'm a little concerned about some of your views about the virtues of the Caterpillar proposal or many of the other job creation schemes, because within the Conservative paper, what's worrying is that there's a real celebration of low-wage jobs. Let's force workers to take a 50% wage cut because that's good for creating jobs. Well, I think we need to balance out our prudent use of public money with an assurance that we have jobs that are fair wage jobs, that are living wage jobs, so that families can actually afford to raise their families, to have holidays, to all of the things. And so the question is, how do you have prudent use and accountable use of public money while ensuring that you have fair and living wage?
Okay.
One of the ways you do that is either by saying that unions are the ones, you have unions that are union contractors that are the ones that get priorities. Other ways you can do that is by, in fact, creating legislative minimums to make sure that wages are decent. So you could have fair wage, you could have living wage conditions.
Okay, I want to follow
there
up
are
on the wage
numbers
issue.
of ways
I want to follow up on the wage issue
that.
because I've read the paper. I don't recall seeing anywhere in the paper where it says our plan is to hopefully get as many people working for as low wages as possible.
Well, when you start saying that it's a good thing that the US and China are converging on wage rates and that maybe should be something we should emulate, I think that's a little bit of a worry in the paper, because which Canadian would like to be driven down to either southern US or Chinese wage rates? I just don't think so.
If these proposals were to go through, do you foresee a kind of a race to the bottom in terms of wages going forward?
That would be my fear. And in the short term, we could have a lot of disruption. So whereas I think that you've got something in that idea of more open bidding, and you know, if you go back and look at when our union and collective bargaining systems were crafted, the whole idea was the market was to act as a check on the power of collective bargaining to simply extort prices from consumers. And that's the force that sometimes when it's missing, yes, you can have excessive costs built up, and that could squelch growth.
But why does it make sense in 2012 to deny anybody, the right to bid on a job just because they don't have unionized workers?
Well, as long as you know very well from your own example, if you've had any person come and fix things in your house, is that the lowest bidder is not always the best craftsman. So we want safe work, and we want quality work, and we want productive work. And sometimes that requires that you hire people of certain skill, which means that you have to pay certain wages.
Well, this is where we bring our friends Moira Welsh and Kevin Donovan into the picture because, as Gregory pointed out, I'm going to read this now because we've alluded to it, but let's get it on the record here. Here's what taxpayers were charged for work done at Toronto Public Schools. Installing a $17 pencil sharpener, $143 to put in 4 screws. The installation of a sign on a school's front lawn, $19,000. An electrical outlet on the wall in a school library, $3,000. A Star investigation has found examples of charges that are out of whack with the amount of work done. The work in question was carried out by some of the 900-strong maintenance and construction tradespeople who have an exclusive contract with the Toronto District School Board. In the case of the electrical plug, the job took 4 hours, but the taxpayers were billed 76 hours, which sources say was done to account for the time of idle workers who had no assignments that week. Charlotte, people look at stories like this and conclude this system is corrupt.
Absolutely, they do conclude that.
Though I have to respectfully submit that these are extreme cases, and it is totally erroneous to assume that every public contract is full of these. So this is a case of fraud and extreme, and may I also say it's a case of management failure, because somebody should have seen that a screwdriver was being billed at and should have said, there's no way we are going to pay.
But I think there is a concern. Of course there is. All of us are taxpayers, and I happen to agree with you that you want to make sure taxpayers' money goes to, whether it be frontline care, whether it go to classrooms, whether it go, but we also want quality work. We want high-skilled, high-wage jobs would be my preference, very much like the German or the Scandinavian model. But the question is, how do you fix this? Do you throw out the entire system? Or do you tweak it? Do you modify it? Because I agree, you do want more accountability. You need better management of the public contracts. You need a better, perhaps, procurement process, which is more transparent.
What about tweaking it, as opposed to throwing out the baby with the bathwater?
Listen, when you have 600,000 men and women who woke up this morning with no job to go to, when we've shed 300,000 manufacturing jobs, the luxury of tweaks is well behind us. I mean, you can't turn a gas guzzler from the 1970s into a Prius just by a few tweaks and wishful thinking. We need fundamental structural reform that will adapt to the realities of 2012. It's not 1972, it's 1946, right? It's 2012. And, you know, it's part of a comprehensive plan with respect to Dr. Verma's comments. Part of our plan includes 200,000 jobs in the skilled trades. But if we can't compete, if we don't have labor laws that allow us to be flexible, to move on a dime when customers change, new markets open up, we're going to shed those jobs. And the other thing too, with respect to open tendering, some of the strongest support we've had on this particular path in our path to prosperity have come from other unions like LIUNA, the Labourers International, Christian Labour Association Canada, CLAC, who both said we're shut out of this bidding. So how is that fair, whether union or non-union? If you can do the work, bid on it, you get the best quality, and you know what, at the end of the day, we can actually invest more in public services by doing so.
Charlotte?
What I find troubling is there's a fallacious assumption that if you make flexible labour markets, you will solve the economic problems. The economic problems we have right now in Ontario are not caused because of inflexible labour markets. In part, it's been precipitated by the 2008 financial crisis, which, quite frankly, if we're going to talk about accountability, I would think we might want to start with the banks. The banks, in fact, have been terribly unaccountable for their behaviour. Most recently been found to be fixing interest rates for their own benefit. Before that, they were loaning money without prudent management of our money, every one of us who deposited. So in that sense, I think it's fallacious to draw a direct link between inflexible labour markets and the current financial problems. Having said that, how do you then fix it? How do you move forward so that we can, in fact, create better jobs, so that we do, in fact, employ and reduce the unemployment rates?
Can we just, for the record, so we don't get sued here, confirm that when you were referring to banks fixing interest rates, you weren't talking about Canadian banks?
No, I'm talking about the British banks
right,
and
British
the
banks,
others. That's very true.
And the LIBOR,
good point.
and 2008.
But given it's a global financial system, it has to have some impact on us.
I hear you, but the most egregious behavior took place on Wall Street, not Bay Street. We should get that on the record.
No, it's very true. And in fact, that's partly because Canadian banks were more highly regulated than the
yes, indeed.
Wall Street.
Gregory, make your point.
And Charlotte, to her credit, has been very critical of unions. She's a critic of union behavior and priorities of long standing, and she's said that they have a reputation for privileging themselves above others, and she's urged them repeatedly to become more active in pursuing employment opportunities for non-members. I mean, one of the most egregious examples in Ontario is the backlog of apprenticeships, where young Ontarians can't get an apprenticeship because there's a barricade erected by the organized labor in this province that's preventing them from getting the skills they need to get a job that could support a family. And the most egregious example, if you look at this Caterpillar situation, the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, which you could argue has very little to do with Ontario or the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, in the time that Caterpillar was grinding 500 jobs, grinding 500 machinists out of their livelihoods.
In London.
Was increasing their investment from $2 million to $77 million. And at the end of June...
In Caterpillar.
So you have government employees unions thinking with their wallets. They're some of the biggest investors in Canadian banks. And they uniformly urge management to grind the workers in the companies they invest in to the outer limits of the law, as they did with Caterpillar.
A little hypocritical there, isn't it?
It's big time hypocritical.
Well, there are, just like there are good and bad hospitals, good and bad universities, we also have good and bad unions. So let me go back to the system and the document that we have about, my own sense is, Tim, that your 7 points, they kind of demonize the unions and sort of say, well, a lot of our problems is on you, and if only you were to disappear, why we could have a prosperous Ontario. But we could have another approach to this, and let me just articulate that, is I feel that we need some kind of a grand idea, a big idea in here to engage people in problem solving, to bring Ontarians together. And I suspect that this document doesn't do it. It divides and polarizes. For example, in Europe, they have this idea of flexibility in exchange for security. So they said, well, workers should give us flexibility, and in exchange for that, we'll provide them more security. It's a bigger idea. Or if I go back to what Charlotte was referring to, the 2008 crisis, there's a great deal of sense of unfairness today among Canadians, among Ontarians, about how some people are very rich or getting richer and others are getting left behind. So why don't we take some overarching idea and say, look, we want everybody to win. We want to be inclusive. We want to bring people in this tent. Now, let's see what changes we need to make in the system. And if there are bad ideas, let's throw them out.
What's wrong with that approach?
But let's work with the institutions.
I think what the professor has talked about, I think we've agreed on a number of things in terms of doing more on the apprenticeship side, on the trade side. We need a comprehensive approach on lowering taxes, a regulatory environment that's actually pro-jobs and pro-growth. That's all part of the plan. I'm not denying that. What I haven't heard from my colleagues across the table is a discussion of why my plan won't create jobs. They may say there's other ways of creating jobs. Great, we'll do that too. But I do believe in my gut that we need to make our labor laws resemble the world that we're competing in 2012. What does that mean? It means giving union members the right to decide if they want to be in a union or not. That will make unions themselves more accountable to the workers. It means that you should have a secret ballot right to decide whether you want to be in a union or not. The current government took that away in some sectors. I think that's wrong. I think it's un-Canadian. And do away with this nefarious, well, probably the wrong word there, but this odious practice of closed tendering that drives up costs. These are reforms that are long overdue. I know that they'll create a lot of debate, but they're the right thing to do, Steve, if we want to create jobs. And it's not anti-union, it's not pro-union, but it's pro-worker and it's pro-jobs.
Well, let me follow up with this. You say it's the right thing to do, and we've heard Dr. Verma already a couple of times say that if you do this, you are going to unleash hell. Now, maybe a hell needs to be unleashed, but you know that you'd have a war with organized labor, the likes of which we haven't seen since your friend Mike Harris was premier. Is that good for Ontario?
Change isn't easy, especially fundamental change, but it's necessary. I mean, if we want to coast along at minimal growth, if we believe Ontario's best days are behind us, then by all means embrace the current system. But if you believe that Ontario can actually be the leader again in Canada, if you believe Ontario's best days are still yet ahead of us, you need to make fundamental change on taxes, on energy, on the regulatory environment, and yes, on our labor laws. And you know what? While they're new ideas and they're bold ideas in Ontario and in Canada, they were advanced years ago in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, the United States. It's time we got with the program and got it in 1946 and 2012.
What do you anticipate Labor's reaction would be if this guy forms a government and tried to bring this in?
Oh, I think large numbers of unions we would have a series of strikes, protests. I think it would be both, there would be protests, and you know that. I mean, obviously, the Conservative Party has faced this before, and they're willing to face that again. That would be the immediate result. I think there would be...
You know when that happened last time under Mike Harris, their popularity actually went up.
Yes, I do. I do know that. Although I must admit that, is that going to happen now when we have the Occupy movement? Is it going to happen now when there's a greater difference? I mean, as Anil was saying, there's greater concern than there was then about the difference between the haves and the have-nots. I don't know, but I think you've asked me what I think Labor's reaction will be. It will be to protest. It will be to mobilize. It will be to articulate alternatives.
Okay, so if he does this and Labor does that, what do you see as the potential disruption to the economy in the province of Ontario if all of that happens?
Well, I think the average citizen is going to be saying at some point in time, saying, look, you are our leaders, whether it's on the labor side or the government, fix it so that we can go to work, we can go to school, we can commute, we can drive to our vacations. So, large scale and long interruption of our way of life is going to be questioned. And I also think that Canadian, there's so much has been said about Canadian values, but one of the Canadian values is to be inclusive and to consult and to mobilize people and to...
well, he's consulting right now. That's why he put the discussion paper out.
Yes.
You're being consulted right here.
Right. But I'm saying that if you start from a point where you've already excluded half the people, and talking about U.S. and other jurisdictions, we have lots of evidence on divisive politics versus inclusive.
And let me ask Gregory that. If this policy were brought in, and if the reaction from Labour was as Charlotte suggested, or were to be what Charlotte suggested, and this were to cost us, say, 1 point or 1.5 points of GDP economic growth, would it still be worth doing?
Well, this was something they struggled with in the 70s in Britain. Everyone was afraid of militant government employees unions, and they cowered in front of them. And in the financial meltdown that Charlotte referred to, 400,000 Canadians lost their jobs in the space of a few months. And yet, in that time, senior Ontario school teachers' wages have gone from $83,000 a year to $95,000 a year, with a $7,800 contribution to their pension plan. They retire at age 59 with a annuity in excess of $500,000.
His parents were teachers, you got to watch the anti-teacher stuff around here.
So $110,000, it's $12,000 more than teachers earn in BC, $20,000 more than they earn in Quebec City. And their friend Dalton McGuinty finally said, hey, we're out of money. Our borrowing costs have jumped $2 billion or 20% since we started doing this. I've borrowed $100 million to keep everyone happy. Could you guys ease off for a year or two? And now we have large-scale social unrest and disruption because, unionized government employees in Ontario will crush anyone who stands in their way, and they demonstrated that to Dalton McGuinty in Kitchener-Waterloo. They deserted him, deserted his cause, just like that.
I got about 30 seconds left here, and I want to give it to the PC leader, because one of the things we've heard about these plans as we wrap it up here is that you want to bring a kind of a right-to-work mentality that they have in places like Mississippi and Alabama to the province of Ontario. And last I checked, not too many people would trade living in Ontario for Mississippi or Alabama. What's your view on that?
People want to see more jobs. They want to see our economy actually grow again. And Steve, we're at a tipping point. And I just refuse to accept this view that Ontario's in decline, and government's role is to gently manage that decline. But if we take bold choices, we make bold decisions like we have in the past, our province will lead this country again. It'll lead in job creation. If we want to increase wages, we want to strengthen our middle class, you need to increase demand for workers, right? Basic economics. How do you do so? Get energy rates under control, lower taxes, a deregulatory environment that will actually be pro-jobs, but yes, bring our labor laws in the 21st century and empower individual workers.
That's Tim Hudak, the Ontario PC Party leader. Thanks for coming in tonight, along with Gregory Thomas from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Anil Verma from the Rotman School of Management, Charlotte Yates from McMaster University. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.